기자부대! Hamon the beat!
Welcome back to another episode of Debunking Araki Forgot Extras, where I take a look at more Araki Forgot topics and try to answer them. We finally reached 10 extras videos, although it's hard to call them extras when there's more here than the original run of videos. But regardless, I still managed to put together a good list of topics again, including some fun ones, so let's get right into the first question. This one asks, since frogs are cold-blooded like vampires, shouldn't the frog have been affected by Hamon when Zeppeli punched it? We're starting off with kind of a ridiculous one here, since this is simply not how vampires or Hamon works in JoJo. I'm thinking that this person got the idea of vampires being cold-blooded from things like Straizo having no body heat. However, the reason vampires are damaged by Hamon and the sun is for a very specific reason. Zeppeli described this in part 1 by saying that the stone mask brings out an evil power from the brain, and that in exchange, the vampire has to gain power from the blood of others. Hamon is also something that works through the blood of the user. The blood of living things carries the same energy as the sun, so a creature like a vampire who gives this energy up becomes a perversion of life. Vampires are incompatible with the energy of the sun, and this is why Hamon destroys them. Frogs and other cold-blooded animals, assuming they haven't been awakened by the stone mask, are just normal creatures, which obviously would not have those negative effects from Hamon or the sun. Next is a question regarding the mechanics of Hamon. The commenter mentions that Zeppeli said that Hamon can only be projected through the arms and legs, but that this was later contradicted when Dyer used Hamon only as a head. This seems to be a bit of a misunderstanding since this is not what Zeppeli said. He said that Hamon can only be sent out through the tips of your extremities, like your hands and feet. However, this is not saying that these are the only places that Hamon can project from. In Dyer's case, something like the tip of his tongue or even his lips could act as a focal point for Hamon. It might not be as potent as Hamon focused to your fist, but it would still work. What Zeppeli says here is still in line with how Hamon is portrayed later. Like Caesar says, creating powerful Hamon requires focusing it to as small a point as possible, like how the pressure of a water gun is stronger if the water goes through a smaller hole. Here's another question which is just kinda funny. This person says that there was no way that Joseph could have pulled out a Tommy gun since 1, he didn't have it on him, and 2, there wasn't one close to him. I feel like most people already see the flaw with this question just from reading it. It's kind of hilarious that the answer he provides to his question is just him restating the question. Like the reason Joseph couldn't have brought out his Tommy gun is because he didn't have a Tommy gun. Well, I feel like this line of reasoning is just fundamentally flawed since evidently Joseph did have a Tommy gun since he took one out. I assume they have some kind of issue with how Joseph could fit the Tommy gun under his jacket, but I simply disagree in this case. Joseph is this huge guy wearing this huge jacket, and I think he could very easily hide the gun underneath. This next person asks why Joseph tried to send Kars into the volcano when it was stated that Kars is immortal and cannot be killed, but that despite this, Joseph still tried to kill him and even thought the lava had worked. Well, this is a pretty obvious one since Joseph simply had no reason to believe that Kars was completely impervious to any attack. After witnessing Kars surviving the sun, Speedwagon says he's unkillable. Of course, for the same reasons as Joseph, he obviously doesn't know the full scope of Kars' abilities and isn't making a definitive statement here. In fact, the vast majority of information on Ultimate Kars comes from narration, which obviously Joseph wouldn't be aware of. From Joseph's perspective, there is no reason to think that the lava couldn't burn Kars up completely. And incidentally, the lava actually would have eventually destroyed Kars since it was shown to damage him. Kars' adaptation obviously allowed him to escape, but he isn't completely incapable of taking damage before he adapts. If he were completely immune in the way this comment describes, then he wouldn't have needed to create this shell to protect himself and would have just taken no damage, which of course is untrue. The next one deals with the final battle of Part 3 and asks how it's possible that Joseph survived having a knife in his throat in the fight against Dio. These kinds of questions always confuse me since I think the knife in Joseph's throat here is actually not even that unbelievable when compared to injuries characters get across the series and just in anime in general. Regardless, the main thing I want to bring up here is that I think people severely overestimate the amount of time Joseph actually spent like this. While the fighting in the anime plays out over the course of tens of minutes, we actually have a very specific amount of time for exactly how long this fight is. In the scene when Dio's going to kill Polnareff, we are told that it's been little over 100 seconds since Kakyoin was defeated. and that in less than half that time, the final battle will be over, meaning that from Kakuin's death all the way up to Dio's defeat, only a bit over 2 minutes had passed. Of course, in Joseph's case, we need to subtract some unknown amount of time off the beginning of that, between Kakuin's death and him being attacked. Later, when Jotaro is in the ambulance with Joseph, his wound has already been patched up, and Jotaro says that it has been 4 minutes since Dio took Joseph's blood. So really, if you take all that into consideration, Joseph was only wounded for a couple minutes, and evidently while the wound was enough to incapacitate him, it was nothing the Speedwagon Foundation couldn't fix, with the actual thing that killed him being Dio taking his blood. This person asks how Rohan was not aware of Josuke's backstory during their fight in Part 4. We saw that Koichi was aware of the story since he tells it to Okuyasu. However, Rohan had been reading Koichi's book, so he should have learned this information already and known not to insult Josuke's hair. There's a few things wrong with this. First of all, while we did see that Rohan was aware of a lot from reading Koichi's pages, he clearly had not read the entirety of Koichi's book. The Heaven's Door book contains details from a person's entire life, and it simply would not be possible for Rohan to get every last detail from it. And the manga itself acknowledges this fact. Rohan removed a page from Koichi to keep for later, which we saw caused him to lose a dramatic amount of weight. And then he had Koichi return so he could get another page. Obviously, he wouldn't have to do this if he already had read everything in his book. And the scene in question with Josuke further supports my point. Rohan is trying to find a way to make Josuke open his eyes, and casually remembers reading about something that makes him mad. Then he finds it and immediately insults Josuke's hair, making him go blind with rage and defeat him. As we can see, Rohan barely knew this information and had to confirm it right then and there, so he wouldn't have read every detail of why Josuke would be so protective of his hairstyle. He would just know that it makes him mad. However, there's another reason why this wouldn't be possible, since Rohan says that it's information Koichi's file didn't contain. This is because Heaven's Door books only contain absolute facts. If Koichi doesn't know something, it cannot have appeared in the book. Koichi says that the story is partly something he overheard, but is mostly guesswork, and that he didn't think Josuke was that serious. He doesn't realize that the story was the real reason behind Josuke's anger until this scene, so it wouldn't have been printed in Koichi's book as a fact for Rohan to have read. The simple fact that Josuke gets mad when you insult his hair, though, is a fact, so it would be printed there. Next, this person asks why when Shigechi accidentally stole the hand, Kira didn't just destroy it to erase the evidence like we see him do with other hands. I would think this is a pretty simple question since Killer Queen is obviously not able to explode anything it wants. Kira or his stand have to be touching the object to transform it into a bomb. Kira didn't expect to have the hand taken, and once it was, he couldn't have made it into a bomb without finding and touching it first, so this just isn't possible. This next one deals with the Bites the Dust arc from the end of Part 4. This person asks why when Kira successfully killed the entire team with Bites the Dust that he didn't just simply deactivate the ability, leaving them all permanently dead. This person seems to simply misunderstand how Bites the Dust actually works. Bites the Dust activates when a person learns Kira's identity from Hayato, causing them to explode and then for time to immediately be reversed to 1 hour prior. Once that hour has passed, that person will explode again, whether they actually learned Kira's identity in this new timeline or not. Of course, if someone else is killed after, it's still possible for time to reverse again to before that other person died, after which they'll die again at the predetermined time. Of course, you can't deactivate the ability until after time had already reversed. So for someone to be permanently killed by Bites the Dust, you have to reach their automatic death in this second loop, and then wait for an hour to pass so that there's no way for the stand to go back to before they're killed. As we saw in the manga, if the ability is deactivated before the automatic death happens, then those people will no longer die at that time, and it's as if they never learned Kira's identity. So this comment seems to be asking why Kira didn't deactivate the ability, when actually him being forced to deactivate it was the entire point, since it prevented those deaths from happening, and Kira hadn't yet reached the opportunity to safely deactivate the power since the victims hadn't automatically exploded yet. In a previous video, I went over the question of why Giorno was not a vampire despite being the son of one. There I explained that that is simply not how being a vampire works in JoJo. You aren't born one, you have to become one. This new comment argues that Giorno actually should be a vampire since he has cells from Dio, just like how Okuyasu's father became a vampire. I'm sure pretty much everyone watching already knows the conclusion here, which is that Okuyasu's father clearly is not a vampire. Beyond the fact that he does not die in the sun or show any of the characteristics of a vampire, the method behind his transformation is simply not at all like the way people actually become vampires as mentioned before, so neither him nor Giorno are anything close to vampires. This next comment is about the fight with Grateful Dead from Part 5. They ask why the turtle Coco Jumbo didn't age, despite being exposed to Grateful Dead's fog. This is a simple one since it's actually directly addressed in the story itself. When Mista comes out of the turtle, he wonders if it's aging too, and says that since turtles live a very long time, it'll be less susceptible to the aging. Now generally tortoises are the ones known for long lifespans, but keep in mind that while he's called a turtle, there actually isn't any distinction between turtle and tortoise in Japanese. So Coco Jumbo's species is uncertain. Regardless, some aquatic turtles also live for quite a long time as well. So since Coco Jumbo has a longer lifespan, he is not affected much by the aging. Next is a question regarding the mechanics of the stand arrow. This comment says that when the arrow was first introduced in Part 4, the implication seemed to be that when someone is pierced by the arrow, they are judged to be worthy or unworthy. If you're unworthy, you die, and if you're worthy, you survive and gain a stand. However, when the arrow is actually used, it seems to work differently. In Koichi's case, it seems like he would have died, but thanks to Josuke healing him, he gained the egg stand. And then if we move forward to Part 6, Jolene and Hermes get stands even though they only got a small wound that seemingly wasn't in danger of killing them. They say that the only time the arrow works as described is in Part 5 when the janitor's soul was directly pierced by Black Sabbath, after which he was judged unworthy and died. This is a pretty interesting question, and the answer may be pretty complicated since it involves looking at multiple parts. First, I want to see exactly how the idea of the arrow judging someone is supposed to work. Back in Part 4, when Keicho shoots the arrow at Koichi, he mentions that it spilled blood, meaning he would die and not awaken a stand. Now this would seem to imply that if the arrow did not spill blood, that means it judged them worthy and that the stand would manifest. However, that isn't necessarily true. With other piercings, we've clearly seen the arrow capable of drawing blood and still granting a stand. I think the idea here is that Keicho also doesn't fully understand the mechanics of the arrow and just seeks out random people to shoot. As we learn later, the arrow has a mind of its own and physically seeks out potential stand users. Keicho's really the only guy going around launching it at people with a bow rather than letting the arrow naturally take its course. So by giving Koichi a serious wound along with being pierced, he's in danger of outright killing Koichi before his stand actually appears. Now for the question of if the stand arrow actually judges people, and how this would work when even minor wounds can create a stand. This is actually answered by Part 5 in its flashback to the story of the meteor. In the year 1978, a group of mineral surveyors encountered the meteor in Cape York, Greenland. Here we're told that the men fell into the crater but only sustained minor cuts on their hands and feet. However, despite this, they contracted some kind of disease and ended up dying. Within 48 hours, they developed tumors across their bodies, and while one man did show signs of a stand ability, they clearly couldn't handle it and both men died. So here we see that the size of the wound doesn't actually determine if the stand arrow can judge you or not. If you are judged worthy by contact with the arrow, you survive and gain a stand, and if you're unworthy, you develop a disease and die. This ties into the idea presented in Part 5 that the arrow performs a culling of life by killing those unworthy and evolving those who are. Now if we go back to Koichi's case, I think we can see here that Keicho was definitely mistaken. Koichi wasn't judged by surviving his wound, but by not dying to the disease. And as we know, Crazy Diamond cannot cure diseases, so if Koichi were truly unworthy, he would have died after being healed by Josuke anyway. Now for a Part 6 question. This mentions Pucci's line where he says that Jolene's stand ability has been trained while Versus only recently awakened his stand. This person says this is a contradiction since Versus would have awakened his stand during the events of Part 3 along with all other living descendants of Jonathan. This comment seems to misunderstand how the awakening of stands back then actually functioned. After Jonathan's body was pierced with a stand arrow, this automatically created stand abilities in all people connected to the body via a psychic link. Then the body emitted a distress signal, causing the stands to awaken whether they were ready to be used or not. This is why Holly and Josuke became sick, since their otherwise dormant abilities weren't ready to come out yet. As we know, after Part 3 when Dio was destroyed, the distress signal stopped and the stands were no longer being forced out and returned to being dormant. And for some, it wouldn't be until years later that they actually awakened their abilities. For example, Giorno. He would have also had a stand at the same time. However, as we saw, Giorno's stand was dormant in his childhood. It hadn't fully manifested, but he could still use its ability. Gold Experience fully awakened when Giorno was 15 due to the presence of powerful stand users nearby. Versus is actually almost exactly the same. He also unconsciously used his stand ability while it was still dormant. It wasn't until Pucci showed up and urged him to awaken his ability that it actually happened. This next person asks why Versus put the sick children in the plane seat to stop Jolene, when he could have simply destroyed the seats to give her no way of escaping the plane. Well, Versus actually did plan to destroy the seats at first. Earlier we see that he was trying to race towards the seats to do just that. But Jolene was able to stop him long enough for them to get ahead of him. Remember that Underworld is a physically weak stand for combat, so if Jolene and Hermes were already at the seats, there was no way he could approach them safely. So instead he had a different plan, to drop the children into the seats. So Jolene would either die to save them, or have her spirit weakened so much from letting them die that she would be easy to fight. This next one deals with Emporio's use of the weather report disc in the final battle. Here they mention that while it's possible for him to have the disc inserted as we saw before, why is he able to control the stand? Since in other examples like Jolene with Star Platinum or FF with the boiling water stand, they had no control over them. Well, I'd like to point out that Emporio isn't actually controlling Weather Report here and says so himself. The stand is acting on its own to attack Pucci with the pure oxygen. In the previous video, I went over the creation of the new universe at the end of part 6. I said that fate rewarded the main characters with new lives and undid the actions of Pucci, which would obviously change the events of part 6 and the future. But that in this universe, the general course of events from parts 1 to 5 would remain unchanged. Someone there argued that because we saw a sign at the end that said Orland instead of Orlando, this meant that large changes did happen. However, I pointed out that this is just an example of wonky Japanese to English translation, and examples like this can be found all over the series, in that it doesn't actually indicate a change to this new universe. However, this new comment says that the location from the ending here actually takes place where the prison is supposed to be, meaning there are large changes and the prison no longer exists in this universe. This is simply incorrect. In this scene, you can very clearly see Green Dolphin Prison across the water, including the long bridge Jolene took to get there at the beginning of the story. And when the alternate Hermes gets kicked off the bus, she says that the bus driver might have thought she was escaping from Green Dolphin, meaning it clearly still exists in this timeline. Next is another one related to the end of part 6. This person asks how an alternate weather report is still alive in the new timeline when he died before the time acceleration in the original universe. There's multiple things wrong with this one. First of all, the whole distinction of someone dying not making it into the new universe was something specifically set up for Pucci's universe. However, the comment is doubly wrong here since that only applied to people that died during the acceleration. Since Weather died before the acceleration, he would be born into this new universe like normal and already exist there. However, none of this applies at all since what we're talking about is the Irene universe from the ending. There, the souls of the original cast are restored and also rewarded with better paths in life by fate. Weather is here as well and also has a better course in life, leading to him meeting back up with them. In the last video, I discussed the fate of Cars from the end of part 2. Someone asked how it was possible that Cars stopped thinking in space while Dio didn't stop thinking in the coffin. There I explained that no set time was given for when Cars stopped thinking. The narration stated that he drifted in space for eternity, so for all we know, it could have been hundreds of years before he actually stopped thinking. However, this comment points out that Cars was only in space for about 100 years, since in part 6 the universe ended around the year 2000. First of all, part 6 takes place in 2012, not the early 2000s. But for whatever reason, this comment seems to believe that the universe ended in part 6. All confusion people have regarding the ending aside, I really don't see how anyone could reach this conclusion since we very clearly saw that the timeline continues at the end in the new world. As I went over before, events outside of part 6 and its characters are mostly unchanged here, as we see in stories that are still in this universe like the Spokeshibe Rohan. Part 2 still happened here, and Cars is still in space, with an endless amount of time in the future to remain there. This next one mentions an error found in part 7. They say that in the scene where Gyro reads the results of the second stage of the race, Hot Pants' horse is listed as European Express. This is a mistake, since her horse is actually named Gets Up, and European Express is the horse of Fritz von Stroheim. However, this is actually a mistake made by the current fan translation of the color scans. If we go back to the black and white scans, the name is listed correctly, and if we check the original Japanese version for both, her name is also correct here. So this mistake isn't actually from the original manga, but rather one made during the fan translation. Next is one I've seen quite a bit since my original Part 7 debunking video. People say that it was stated that D4C cannot bring money between dimensions, but that this was contradicted by Diego and Hot Pants' fight with Valentine, where Diego uses money from his pocket to collide with the money in the alternate Diego's pocket to damage him. However, the idea that this is saying that D4C is completely incapable of bringing money across dimensions is a complete misinterpretation. It isn't just flatly stating that money cannot be brought over. You need to look at the context of where this is said. In this paragraph, it says that if the same objects or people from other dimensions meet, they'll be destroyed, so you have to use caution. Therefore, you can't bring money with you, since as we saw, you're at danger of having it collide with a copy of the same money. So it is not saying that money is incapable of going across dimensions. The stand having a restriction as specific as that would obviously be ridiculous. It is saying that in the context of needing to take caution with what you bring across universes, you can't bring money with you or else you'll put yourself in danger. Another one I've seen quite a bit is people saying that the alternate Diego's use of the world is inconsistent with how the stand normally works. They say that Diego is seemingly able to spam his time stop, unlike Jotaro, whose human body limited how frequently he could stop time. I've gotten similar comments asking how Dio is able to spam the ability without any cooldown in the staircase scene. First of all, we should establish what limitation, if any, there is on cooldown between time stops. The only time a cooldown for the ability has ever been mentioned is late in Part 6, with Jotaro saying that once a time stop ends, it takes a few seconds before he is able to stop time again. However, at no point is this ever said to be as a result of him being human rather than a vampire. In fact, I'd say that this same limitation applies to both Dio and Diego as well. Let's take a look at Dio first. The comment claims that Dio consecutively spammed time stop during the staircase scene. However, this just doesn't happen. We see Polnareff move down the stairs, Polnareff has time to realize what has happened, is shocked for a bit, and then tries moving forward again, and then he's moved back again. All of these instances of time stop very clearly have some amount of time in between. With the cooldown stated to only be for about 3 seconds, it wouldn't be hard for Dio to do this at all. Now for Diego. From the start of his fight with Johnny until the ending, he stops time on 10 different occasions. Each of these times are shown with plenty of time in between, even more so than the staircase scene. The only two that I could see being somewhat close together here would be when Diego stops time to throw a can of fuel at Johnny, after which we see time resume and a few seconds pass as he takes out matches and Johnny realizes what's going on, before he stops time again to throw the matches. Again, we are clearly shown time resuming and a decent amount of time passing until the next time stop, so I can't see anything here that could actually be construed as spamming. Based on the comments, they would seem to be implying that the characters are consecutively stopping time. This is just self-evidently not true, since we have always seen time resume between each time stop. If Dio or Diego could truly spam time stop, then there would be no downtime at all and they would be completely invincible. Next is one for Part 8. They ask why Kira had to steal the Lokakaka when we know that Holly was actually researching the fruit at the hospital while this was happening. They also ask if Holly knew her disease was caused by the fruit, and if so, why Kira would want the fruit at all. Well, let's take a step back to look at the whole situation. Holly was working at the hospital when the rock humans infiltrated the staff and they started to secretly test the fruit on her. She says that at first she just thought she was overworked and then started losing her memories and the passage of time as her condition worsened. She says that at the time she didn't know what was happening to her. This was happening while Kira was at sea as a ship's doctor, and during that is when he discovers the existence of the fruit by finding the rock human's cargo shipment. Kira independently learned everything about the fruit and its effects by investigating the baseball pitcher. Now we do know that at some point Holly became aware of the fruit and that being the cause of her disease. This makes sense since knowledge of the fruit would become somewhat public leading up to the announcement of the 6251 serum. However, she was unable to share this information with Kira, first because her disease had progressed so much that she was hardly even able to recognize Kira and stayed bedridden. And more importantly, she mentions that the head doctor's power of calamity prevented her from acting against him in any way. So Kira had no reason to believe that the fruit was the cause of Holly's condition, and it makes sense that he would pursue the fruit here. Finally, we have a question that's actually related to Part 9. Now at this point, I'm not planning on covering Part 9 topics before the part is over, just like I did for Part 8. But this topic in particular is more so related to the spin-off, the Spokushibe Rohan, so I think I could cover it here. The comment brings up how I mentioned that some Rohan chapters have included references to Morioh of Part 8, such as the Seiten Birdies baseball team and the Twin Pines. But that now that a version of Rohan exists in Part 9, this means that the post-2011 Rohan stories are set in this universe, which introduces a contradiction due to all the references to the original universe they included. Really, I think this is just making a problem for problem's sake. There's simply no reason to actually believe that the Rohan chapters are set in the new universe. Now, I've seen some people argue that the newest chapters like Hot Summer Martha and Drip Painting Style could be. And while I disagree, since it was actually said that they are in the original world of JoJo, it's at least a plausible thing to think since they're separated from the other chapters by a number of years. But for the earlier chapters, this idea is simply ridiculous. First of all, the chapters including references to the new Morioh simply has no bearing at all on which universe they're set in. Simply adding something like a baseball team for Morioh and the location of the Twin Pines are simple nods to the new universe. It's no more of a confirmation of them being the same universe than the new Morioh including references to the old one is. I just don't see how little references like this indicate that it's in the new universe, when the chapters already contain major concrete examples of characters from the old universe like Yukiko, Koichi, and Josuke that we know definitely do not exist in the new one. To act like the little references to Part 8 make the chapter set there, and that the big connections to Part 4 are somehow now plot holes is simply ridiculous. A version of Rohan existing in Part 9 also doesn't mean that any of these chapters are set there. He's a different Rohan, just like all the other times we've had references to past characters in this new universe. And that's every Araki Forgot topic for now. 10 extras videos is definitely a big milestone, and I'm proud of the amount of topics I've been able to cover across this whole series. I absolutely plan on still making these, since not only is this one of the most fun kinds of videos for me, and is no doubt entertaining for people to watch, I do think that it's also a helpful tool for clearing up misconceptions in the series which still exist to this day. Over the years, I've gotten countless topics submitted, and of course not all of them have had the chance to make it into a video yet. In some cases, this is actually because I get a lot of questions that don't really count as Araki Forgot or plot hole related topics. A lot of the times, people simply have questions related to trivia or little hypotheticals they want to hear my opinion on. So I'd actually like to announce a new series I want to make where I answer these kinds of questions. Sort of like a more neutral version of Debunking Araki Forgot, just aimed at other common questions fans have regarding the series. If there's a question like this you'd like to see me go over, you could comment it below or pay a visit to my community post about the video and leave it there. Hopefully I'll get a lot of questions and be able to make a video on it sometime soon. Now, if there's a topic you want to submit that is related to Araki Forgot, I also ask that you comment it below or leave it as a reply to the pinned comment. I ask that you don't reply to other people inside the comment thread too much though, since it'll make it reach the reply limit. If you want to be updated on new videos, make sure to subscribe and click the bell. You can also be updated on new videos and JoJo news by joining the Hamon Discord using the link in the description. Finally, I'd appreciate if you help support the channel on Patreon. There you receive Discord perks, and you can submit a patron question. This video's question comes from Nutrocker. They ask, what are my favorite and least favorite JoJo story arcs? Well, I've answered my favorites before, so you can check out my answer to that as the first one I go over in my patron Q&A video. Now for the least favorite, that's actually an interesting question since I honestly don't dislike any of the major story moments in JoJo. But I think I can actually pick out which ones are the least good for me. In part 1, I would say the weakest part of the story would be the fight with Jack the Ripper in the tunnel, which just isn't as interesting as the other fights. For part 2, this is really difficult, but I'd probably go with Joseph's first fight with Wamuu, which isn't as good as his second. For part 3 onward, it's easier since there's a lot of smaller fights to pick from. I'd say High Priestess is probably at the bottom for me since it's just not that interesting of a stand. For part 4, I'll go with Superfly, which I just never found that good, especially since it's surrounded by all the excellent late part 4 fights. For part 5, it's probably Notorious B.I.G., since even Araki has said that the stand itself is more like an afterthought compared to Trish getting Spice Girl. He actually said he enjoyed drawing the user more than the stand here. For part 6, I'm going with the fight with Lang Wrangler, which I feel like is pretty forgettable outside of the main gimmick of the fight, and is more like a minor obstacle before the more interesting scene in the courtyard. For part 7, I definitely pick one of the earlier fights, in this case the Boom Boom family, which are kind of forgettable and not as fleshed out as part 7 would later get. In part 8, I love how almost all the fights play out, but I'd probably go with the Paper Moon Deception arc, since it mostly just involved Yasuho wandering around under the effects of the stand without much actually happening. Finally, for Thus Spoke Shibe Rohan, I'd say my least favorite chapter is Harvest Moon. Of the chapters that don't prominently feature Rohan, it's definitely the worst, although I do still like it and it's a fun idea for a story. If you want to submit a question, you can join the Patreon at any tier and submit them in the member chat. You can also DM the questions to me directly. I try to answer one question per video, so I ask that you submit as many of them as you want. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Sloth Dog, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Almighty Quarth, Gatlin Grove, Lime Jinjo, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rihanna Meme, Christian McDonough, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Great Riek, Carmo Trina, Adam Grogan, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Professor Foosball, Ryan Ramirez, Big T, C Manga, Minty, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Nutrocker, and Dario 10.